Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final session in this series of webinars that we've been holding on the 70th anniversary of UNHCR's statute. It has been a wonderful 10 days of sessions from all over the world. This final session, which will focus on where protection solutions are going in the future, will start in a minute. But first, might I thank you for showing up this afternoon. I hope you have a great experience, and I will now introduce my fellow presenter, Rachel Criswell, who is a Senior Protection Officer at UNHCR and who will say a few words of introduction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to this, our final of 20 sessions in just over a week. I want to start by thanking the hosts of the 19 other panels from the University of Essex, who is hosting us once again today, to all of our partners in the various regions of the world who helped to make this event possible, as well as those who so kindly are interpreting for us so that we can have a multilingual conversation over this period of time. This morning, we really looked at some of the protection challenges, some of the protection opportunities that have arisen. And this afternoon will be more of a chance to pull on different key themes that have come up related to solutions from various different areas of expertise. Throughout what we're talking about today, we will be listing a number of sites to both practitioner groups that are working around these areas of solutions, as well as some of the gray literature that has come up in the policy world that those of you who are most especially emerging scholars may not have had the opportunity to follow in the last couple of years since the Global Compact was affirmed. It's a real privilege for me to get to be part of the Secretariat for the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network under Jeff. And we look forward this day to highlighting some of those practice and academic links to further the research dialogue in the months and years to come. Now, Jeff, back to you for some technical details.
Thank you, Rachel. As Rachel's just said, there are some technical aspects with the platform. If you encounter any technical problems at all during the session, it is being live streamed on the Human Rights Centre's YouTube channel, which uses less bandwidth, but does not allow for the same amount of interactivity. To connect to it, just follow the link that you'll see in the chat box now. Interpretations available in English, Spanish, and Arabic. And as you can see, we have International Sign Language available as well. You do need, though, to have the latest version of Zoom downloaded in order to use the interpretation function. Closed captions are also available for this event by clicking on the CC at the bottom of the screen. If you wish to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function, again at the bottom of your screen, that will allow you to ask questions. That is being monitored all the time, and those questions will then be passed on to us so that we can address them during our discussion now. And with that, can I first reiterate Rachel's thanks for all the work done by all the other panels. As chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, it's been a privilege to be involved in all of this and to work with so many practitioners, emerging scholars, but especially people who have been forcibly displaced, who, courtesy of the Zoom platform, we've been able to include either both as participants, but also people in situations of displacement have been able to join these conversations as well. It's an amazing achievement and one that we would never have thought of back in 2017 when this conference was first sort of discussed. I'll turn now to my opening sort of comment. It relates to the Global Compact on Refugees because while we're looking at 70 years of UNHCR and its statute, going forward, the Global Compact on Refugees is going to be one of the framing documents for how protection and solutions are achieved in practice. And those of us in the formal consultations for the Global Compact remember the firm attitude of states that it should create no new obligations. That's understandable when 85% of persons of concern to UNHCR are hosted in low or middle income countries. Only if states had previously agreed to something could it be incorporated into the GCR. That is why the GCR's objectives in Article 7, which are to ease pressure on host countries, enhance refugee self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, and support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity, that they were taken from the 2016 New York Declaration, which had been adopted by the UN General Assembly, and Article 10 incorporates the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, again from 2016, as part 2 of the GCR. Nevertheless, Article 5 lists all the international human rights law treaties. It also includes international refugee law as the bedrock of the Global Compact and refers to international humanitarian law as well. Article 9 brings in the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework on protection in disasters. What was so interesting about this series of webinars was how certain themes kept recurring across the different time zones. We effectively covered every single time zone through the 11 research institutes and universities who hosted panels. One of those themes was the effect of climate anomalies and their impact on displacement and conflict. Another was access to education, not just for the children of school age, but also by university and tertiary level education scholars. The need for regional and global responses. That came to the fore in one of the panels hosted by the Kaldor Centre on Rohingya, where it looked at the support to Rohingya given by Bangladesh, Thailand and Malaysia, but also referred to the need for China, Japan, Australia and New Zealand from the region to be involved in looking for solutions. Plus, and this is something that is so important, the UN Security Council. That concept comes from the Global Compact itself, where fairer and more predictable burden and responsibility sharing is a role for the international community as a whole, which doesn't just mean states, it includes international organizations, and that would include UN agencies like UNHCR, but also the Security Council itself, which isn't this sort of separate entity. It's a group of 15 states, and their role is so significant when we're looking for solutions. Those ideas also came to the fore in one of the panels from South and Central America, dealing with Honduras. So all these ideas that we kept on seeing that came up from across the globe, that's been one of the most exciting aspects of looking at protection and solutions 70 years into the statute. It's so important when we're thinking about protection and solutions that we realize this is a global activity with regional experiences. I should say that the international community as a whole also includes academics who provide analysis. Well, I would, wouldn't I, being an academic? And the West Africa panel referred to ECOWAS's call for multi-country data collected under a common methodology. Now, UNHCR utilizes the fantastic multidisciplinary research in promoting protection and seeking solutions, but that depends on access by academics to accurate and comparable data. In that regard, Rachel, how can UNHCR facilitate the highest quality independent research and analysis?
Thank you, Jeff, for that great question. I think really it goes back to the data, and we have to consider something that was talked about quite a bit in the panels, being the protracted nature of displacement today. The Global Trends Report for UNHCR from 2019 estimates that approximately 77% of refugees are in situations where they've been displaced for at least 5 years. And indeed, when you consider internal displacement, that number is quite substantially larger. That means, as we heard in the East Africa panel, you have to have the ability to do joined up planning between the host community and the displaced community. That's necessary, that planning is necessary so that you can also have funding that addresses needs going on, not in a short emergency cycle of 6 months or a year, but the multi-year infrastructure investments, education investments that are necessary to address protracted displacement. That means you have to have data that talks to each other related to the host community and to the displaced community. And one of the key efforts that has been undertaken by UNHCR and the World Bank in the last couple of years is the establishment of a joint data center. The JDC collects, analyzes, and disseminates primary socioeconomic data. That's microdata, for a layperson like me, household level data that enables informed policymaking and programming. And I should add that the JDC is working not just on refugee data and that of refugee host communities, but they're also working on building and refining IDP and statelessness statistics. And they have open source versions of this data that are available online, and a link to where to access that is just showing up in the chat. As part of their work on the analysis, the Joint Data Center is also encouraging academic conversations, including an academic conference on internal displacement that will now take place in 2022 because of COVID. And there have also been a number of articles published in the Journal of Development Economics from last year's conference pre-COVID that took place as well. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention here, for those of you who are not familiar with microdata sets, as is the case for me as a non-economist, that the I in GAIN is really, really important. We need interdisciplinary understanding of these data sets. So one of the things we would really love to see in the research agenda going forward is not just socioeconomic analysis of particular areas where the open source data is already available, but considerations from anthropologists, from lawyers, from those who analyze policy to give a holistic picture of what is needed by host communities and forcibly displaced communities as well. Jeff, just as we need different research backgrounds to give us that holistic picture in the response, to have meaningful burden and responsibility sharing, as we talk about in the GCR, we also need everyone to play their part, that whole of society response concept. Could you now reflect for us some of the whole of society elements that came up in the course of our conversations on the panels?
Well, I can definitely talk about something that you just mentioned, which is the interdisciplinary character of the panelists. We had not just lawyers like myself, but we had anthropologists, we had geographers, we had economists, all speaking and contributing to this discussion, because whole of society includes academia, but it also includes local authorities and cities, because they're the ones where the vast majority of displaced persons now, over 60% of displaced persons, aren't in isolated refugee settlements, they're in urban settings. So we're talking about whole of society. We're not talking, and it's interesting in the Global Compact that one of the changes that you see that reveals UNHCR's expanding mandate, but just actually reinforces how that mandate. The 1950 statute talked about protection of refugees. The mandate expanded. It included stateless persons. It includes internally displaced persons. But the Global Compact on Refugees, while not including host communities in UNHCR's mandate, says that in implementing that mandate of protecting refugees, IDPs, and stateless persons, you've got to take into account the host community as well, alongside the persons of concern to UNHCR. And I think this is something that the GCR calls for, and therefore why the whole of society approach that you see in the Global Compact, including academics, local authorities, cities, faith groups, so many different actors, is so important. We've talked about COVID more than once already. I think one of the things that COVID incidentally caused was fear of persons from outside. This is something that happens whenever you get large-scale displacement amongst communities. And it is one of UNHCR's roles, one of the roles of our roles in advocating on behalf of the protection of displaced persons, that we make certain that we address any concerns in host communities about the arrival of displaced populations. I should say, though, having worked with UNHCR in the field, host societies in the lower middle income countries, which I have visited on behalf of UNHCR, is so much more welcoming. I still remember it being in Difa, which is in southeast Niger. Niger is one of the poorest countries on the planet. And they were receiving refugees from Nigeria fleeing Boko Haram. And the local villages, with assistance from UNHCR, who provided the materials, allowed the displaced population to build their accommodation on the side of their own homes. So UNHCR was providing wood and breeze blocks and other forms to make the buildings possible. But the actual locals were saying, okay, yeah, just stick it on the side here, because that would facilitate access to other utilities as well. It's strangely the global north, where you see xenophobia towards displaced persons much more than you ever do in lower middle income countries. And I think that xenophobia is something that we need to address. It was something that was discussed in panels. Xenophobia is wrong at all times, but with regard to persons who have been forced to flee due to conflict or persecution, whether internally or across borders, that's something that our research has to address, and we have to have impact in that field. And it's why philosophers, it was actually a philosopher, Professor Honora O'Neill, back in the late 80s, early 90s, who was one of my colleagues back then, who showed me the need for interdisciplinary research. And that helped shape my understanding that law is important, but law isn't everything. And Rachel, I suppose one of the areas where we probably need to discuss, because it's something that appears on UNHCR's homepage when you look at their facts and figures. One of the interesting things is for the first time, Venezuelan displacement has been listed as a separate category. And I think this is something where research really is needed because of the classification. Refugees are defined in international law. We know what a refugee is. IDPs, we have a reasonable idea. Stateless, we might not know numbers, but we know what a stateless person is in international law. But when we look at mixed movements, which we see across the planet, this is something too that we need research on. How does UNHCR view all these mixed movements?
Thanks, Jeff. And I think we spoke to mixed movements a little bit this morning with Madeline Garlick, who is one of our world experts on that. So definitely, colleagues, go back and listen to that if you weren't able to join us this morning. But a critical component of mixed movements, and indeed the nature of a lot of the displacement in South America, is related to its urban nature, where you have migrants and you have refugees and you have asylum seekers and internally displaced all coming together into city contexts. And that was something we had come up in the chat this morning that we couldn't quite get to. And I want to talk about it related to this now, because I think it's a really important reality that about 61% of all refugees and 80% of internally displaced people actually live in urban areas today. And this is, of course, a trend we anticipate we will see more urbanization between now and 2030 than we have even today. And that means cities are really on the front lines of figuring out how to respond in these mixed movement situations. And one of the ways we've seen that so clearly is in how they've responded to COVID. In the opening panel, we had the Geneva Cities Hub talking about how important it is to invest in cities as frontline responders. And they've been doing things like making sure there is free access to healthcare for refugees and migrants, facilitating opportunities for direct cash assistance, making sure that there's multilingual information on how to prevent the transmission of COVID and what measures are expected by the government. And then there are some things that are very uniquely urban in how they've needed to respond. So for example, placing moratoriums on rent hikes or on evictions, very much related to that renter environment and a different form of shelter than that which you were just talking about related to DIFA. In terms of some of the new initiatives and some of the great literature that's available related to this subject, I really want to highlight the work that has happened through the COVID sensitive response tracker, the link for which should be going in right now, which has highlighted how cities have been negotiating exactly these mixed movements, and most especially considering the forced displacement solutions that are needed within this wider ecosystem. And I would be remiss if I didn't also highlight the tremendous work that's been going on for several years now for the Cities with Refugees Coalition, an initiative that actually began before the Global Compact was affirmed and now is a couple hundred different cities strong. And they're producing really interesting case studies, such as one that was discussed in detail for Durban, South Africa, back in the month of December, Durban being the first city that actually made a pledge at the Global Refugee Forum to support forcibly displaced people. Now, as it relates to the call for further research in this area, in that nexus of movement in cities, I would really encourage people to go back to the webpage from the 2018 High Commissioner's Dialogue, most especially the regional summaries there. The entire event was on urban displacement and solutions to urban displacement, and some really fascinating themes that warrant more research came out, such as the role of youth, the role that innovative partnerships played, what were the significant elements to consider in a gender-sensitive urban response, and then also thinking about, instead of looking at the burden side of the equation, what's possible when cities use the influx of forcibly displaced people to improve infrastructure, most especially infrastructure around health, so critical in the pandemic today, infrastructure around WASH, and then, of course, also on education. And Jeff, education is something that came up over and over and over again as a key solution. I think actually my favorite quotation from all of our panels was one that said, like a passport, education goes with you everywhere. So as we now turn to talking about enhancing refugee self-reliance, that key GCR objective, could you reflect for us a little bit on what we heard about education as a solution for self-reliance?
Can I start by saying that that quotation I remember well, but equally, what's so important from my perspective was seeing how many people who had been forcibly displaced were actually on the panels now presenting. Some of them had been displaced many years ago, but one or two of them were actually very much young people who were now contributing. And tertiary education follows primary and secondary. So let's start by talking about school age education and then move into tertiary education, because forcibly displaced children have reduced access to education. And UNHCR has, almost since its inception, tried to facilitate access to education for all displaced children. And I've seen this in practice, whether that's UNHCR facilitating distance learning or actually working with local actors in order to allow schools to be built. One of the things I think that people forget is that a child in school is much safer than a child on the streets. And therefore, education is actually a direct form of protection, as well as a passport to the future and to their autonomy in seeking a solution. So primary education, I think it's something like only 50% of primary age refugee children get to go to school. I may be wrong on that. It's much reduced by the time you get to secondary. But by the time you get to tertiary level education, it's 3%. Only 3% of displaced persons manage to enter tertiary education at the minute. And one of the things that UNHCR is promoting at the minute is its Aiming Higher initiative. I think there will be a link somewhere very soon in the chat box, which is also known as 1530, I think. And 1530 is about making 15% of refugees of tertiary education age access education by 2030. So by the time of the Sustainable Development Goals being fulfilled, we hope, 15%, not just 3%, 15%, a 5-fold increase. But that will require contributions. I should say that UNHCR put out a request for funding recently in this regard. They were hoping to get 70 additional scholarships. I think it was 85 last week. For all I know, it's now much higher. But yeah, that's a great start. But that's not going to resolve tertiary education for displaced persons. For that, we're also looking at something that I think COVID has actually taught us. COVID has taught us that we can actually talk to our computers and actually engage with people all around the world. It's not enough that we have conferences like this. Conferences like this are really interesting, really important. But if we're going to have tertiary level education, then there needs to be much greater engagement by academics in the global north, working with academics who are local to the populations who've been displaced. We need this greater burden and responsibility sharing, and academia can be part of that. And that means that we work with, we make connections with. We don't say, by the way, if you come along to this web address, you can watch a whole load of academics who have no experience of being in the field at all. But we study it through books. No, we work with institutions in the lower middle income countries to facilitate education for people who are displaced, even if scholarships are not available to allow them to come and study in universities in the global north. It's got to be equal quality education as well. We can't have a cut down version for the web and the internet Zoom as against the full immersion version you get by coming to universities like Essex. I should say in this regard that the Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium and World University Service of Canada are two of the leaders in this field, and we really do need to emphasize the work they've been doing in the past. I can see some links have already gone up for CLCC. WUSC is there too. WUSC is available if you want to download it. I should say that one of my meetings tomorrow at the University of Essex is about us becoming a University of Sanctuary. We've just been given that status. Colchester, where the university is located, is a city of sanctuary, and now the University of Essex has just before Christmas, we got the documentation through just after Christmas, become a University of Sanctuary. We're offering scholarships, but much more. We're engaging with displaced persons who are in the United Kingdom, working with asylum seekers. And I think this is really one of the most important things. As people will know, last week we had two webinar days, the 19th and the 21st, Tuesday and Thursday. In the middle, I did another webinar with the University of Bremen, in which we were again engaging with forcibly displaced youth who had come to Bremen. The University of Bremen had been ahead of the field in this. Whenever displaced persons came to Bremen, the university offered language classes, because to go to university in Germany, you need level C1 German. The University of Bremen had provided free courses on that for ages. And we had two displaced persons who were now studying at university level because of the free language courses offered by the University of Bremen. And they were now studying their discipline in German. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that universities can do. I should add, we also have the Refugee Student Network, which is associated with the GRF and GCR as well. It's come out of that. Again, refugee youth. That's so important. The reason, because education is a gateway. Education, I have taught many refugees over the years as an academic, and the number who, because of what they learned studying, when it became possible to go back to their country of nationality, they were equipped and willing. So many of the graduates I taught are now back in their home countries. And I suppose what I wanted to ask you, Rachel, is how much does education lead to livelihoods and decent work?
Yeah. So Jeff, yes, absolutely. For UNHCR, we very clearly say that tertiary education, and indeed vocational training as well, which I don't think we've mentioned yet in this conversation, is a critical component in self-reliance from the transition from learning to earning. And that it is a critical component for work that is dignified, work in safety. But it is important to reflect what we heard in the panels in terms of key challenges around dignified and safe work, because this was really something that came up quite a lot, from the inadequacies of temporary seasonal work permits in the Pacific to analysis of what had worked and had not worked on the Jordan Jobs Compact, through to discussions of the realities for refugees and asylum seekers in the workplace in Malawi, all the way through to some good practice examples that were shared of Mexico, where asylum seekers are permitted to work while they are waiting for their status determination, and indeed the work that's happened in Uganda under their comprehensive refugee response to ensure freedom of movement and the ability of displaced people to work. I don't think it's a coincidence that we had the ratio of challenges we did to the number of good practices, because that tracks actually fairly well with the data that we had from 2019, the last Global Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Survey, that indicated that 70% of refugees live in countries with restrictions on the right to work, and 47% of refugees are in countries with restricted access to bank accounts. And I would add a point here as well, that we also know that, of course, access to bank accounts is also a critical issue for stateless people, whose lack of documentation also often prevents them from accessing basic financial services. There are a number of initiatives related to the Global Compact on Refugees that are underway to try to change the systems that result in these inequities. And a link should be going up now that gives a good overview of several multilateral partners working together with UNHCR to try to make the ability to access dignified and safe work possible. But we also had some mention throughout the conference of some really interesting practitioner-led efforts that have come up as a result of the GCR and as a result of the Global Refugee Forum. One of those mentioned was the Self-Reliance Index, which is a combined community of practice of a number of universities, some think tanks, and a significant number of NGOs who have come together and said, what does self-reliance actually look at? What are the key indicators? And they have now tested that for more than 2 years. It's in its 3rd year of implementation. And so are developing a new data set around what does the evidence for this concept of self-reliance actually look like. Another group that is related very much to a pledge that was made at the Global Refugee Forum is the Poverty Alleviation Coalition. This is a partnership between UNHCR, the World Bank Partnership for Economic Inclusion, and a growing number of NGOs that are taking a well-known methodology from the development world, the graduation approach, and are applying it to hosting communities and the displaced with them, frequently in a 70-30 mix of applying it in the well-known host community context, and then with the displaced communities as well. When last I looked, that was being applied in 4 different contexts, but they're hoping to expand that quite a bit between now and 2023. And it's a well-established methodology that can be looked at and researched. A brief mention of the ongoing research needs that there still are around refugee self-reliance. So obviously we've talked a bit about the legal barriers, as well as, frankly, once you've overcome the legal barriers, there's all of the issues around lack of awareness of how refugees' economic inclusion can be supported. And so more work on those things are very much needed. And I would underscore that research must be informed by persons of concern themselves. And then secondly, a call we heard over and over and over again from the panels is the need to have more research on the benefits displaced people bring as potential contributors to local economies and host communities. Very much a subject that's important to continue the research on. So Jeff, we've talked a little bit about the different aspects of this self-reliance objective. I'm just taking a quick moment to look at the Q&A. I know that the point on voluntary repatriation, I think we'll cover in a few minutes. But do you want to talk to this point about IDPs, higher education, before we move on into the next GCR objective? You're on mute, I'm afraid.
I apologize, 2020 still continues into 2021. I was on mute. So yes, of course, we need there to be broader access to tertiary education for everybody in society, not just for those who are being displaced. I suppose, being a conference though on UNHCR's mandate, it's not for us to, or not for me as an academic, to tell UNHCR how to run its own mandate. Its mandate is for refugees, IDPs, and stateless persons. So yes, there are more global issues to do with access to education for the whole of society, and UNHCR and the Global Compact on Refugees does talk about protection and assistance to refugees and host communities. So there is some scope, but I believe that in this particular regard, UNHCR's mandate is to try and achieve greater access for those persons who are concerned to the organisation. And in doing that, and this is one of the benefits of UNHCR's work generally, it improves the conditions for everybody there because it works with governments. So humanitarian activities tend to be independent of the state, but with protracted displacement, you're moving into an area where you have development activities going on at the same time that provide protection over the duration of displacement. So UNHCR's role with respect to refugees, internally displaced persons, and stateless persons should, if it increases access for them to tertiary education, at the same time facilitate the state's ability to increase access for everybody in society. But that is actually the role of other UN agencies. The UNDP, I did some research for UNHCR back in 2014 on rule of law. And one of the main reasons for carrying out that research was because UNDP uses rule of law language. UNHCR at the time had a different conception of rule of law. Take a look at the 2015 Note on International Protection if you want to see UNHCR's development of its concept of rule of law. But that research, those changes, which I did with Anna Magdalena Rusch, we put in place a process within UNHCR so that it would work more readily with development actors in order to achieve whole of society solutions which would benefit refugees at the same time. UNHCR's mandate: refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless persons. They're the people UNHCR will advocate for. They're the people that UNHCR will protect and assist. But by doing that work, by engaging with the international community as a whole, which includes other UN agencies, UNHCR will also facilitate access by other parts of that society that is doing so much to provide protection on the ground. Rachel, did you want to add anything to what I've just said?
No, Jeff, that's great. I think there's also some more connections on how this connects to SDG 4 on education, but that's going up in the chat. And given the time, we should probably move on to the durable solutions.
So, durable solutions, Rachel. How do we create conditions conducive to return? Okay, because that's what the GCR calls for.
Yes, indeed. So 2 of the objectives of the GCR are related to durable solutions. One on resettlement and complementary pathways, and the other one on voluntary repatriation. And there was one question in the chat here about what number of people are actually able to avail themselves of these solutions. Well, in 2019, when we had about 78.5 million refugees, displaced people, that includes IDPs and all of the other categories, less than 6 million were able to either be resettled and have a third country solution, or indeed return in safety and dignity to their country of origin. And that number for particularly voluntary repatriation was extremely small. So well under a million, in the under 200,000, I believe, is the statistic from that year. And so that also ties to another question we've had about enabling the ability for returns, and doesn't it make sense to be able to return home? And yes, but UNHCR's stance is very much that that has to be done in a voluntary manner, and it has to be done with safety and in dignity. We talked this morning very much about the big scale issues around voluntary repatriation related to the Security Council and peace and root causes. So as this is a conversation on solutions, I want to zero in a little bit more on some of the challenges that are more localized. So for example, we had conversation that came up in the Southern Africa sessions, in some of the Asia conversations, in West and Central Africa, that highlighted issues around intercommunal tensions, housing, land, and property issues. And these are things that also have to be resolved along with the big global processes to make sure that return in safety and dignity can actually happen. Now, related to some of the materials that are out there now that it's good to highlight that are available. So we've had for 10 years now the framework for the Interagency Standing Committee. That's humanitarian group that involves UN humanitarian actors, NGO actors, all coming together to figure out, in this case, what do durable solutions look like for internally displaced people? And GIPS, the profiling service for internally displaced people, has actually worked on an indicator framework related to that, which now produces a series of profiles that touch on exactly a number of these intersectoral issues on safety, on access to livelihoods, on housing, land, and property, that are all essential to realize the durable solution of voluntary returns. Now, looking at these localized issues, there are a couple of interesting options, I think, for research. First of all, I would encourage that people look at the 2020 UNHCR update on voluntary repatriation, which both highlighted a number of cases where voluntary return has taken place, but also speaks to a number of these issues that are coming up, most especially highlighting issues around overstretched service provision, absence of viable livelihood opportunities, and housing, land, and property came up there too, just as it did in our panels. And there's material on housing, land, and property, both in the protection clusters work and also in the shelter clusters work, that is also worth taking a look at. Jeff, is there anything further you would like to speak to on voluntary repatriation? If not, perhaps we should move on to resettlement and third country solutions.
I suppose one of the things that we need to talk about in relation to VolRep, I mean, talking about the micro level for voluntary repatriation, as opposed to the international relations political dimension, is that we've always got to remember that forcibly displaced persons retain their autonomy. So if they choose to go back, they have freedom of movement. It is not for international organizations or for states to prevent people going back if that's their choice. That might sound as though I'm criticizing UNHCR for something it doesn't do. It's not that. It's that we often talk about voluntary repatriation as though it's something that we, as actors from the global north, the protection industry, if you feel like, confer on forcibly displaced persons. Voluntary repatriation is a choice made by displaced persons based on what we hope is accurate information, continuing protection by international actors in the field back in their country of nationality. It's not as though UNHCR takes refugees to the border and just waves goodbye. UNHCR, when it's engaging in voluntary repatriation, continues that protection for returnees back into their country of nationality. And I think this aspect of voluntary repatriation, which recognizes the autonomy of refugees in a context where they are still protected until they have a durable and sustainable solution. So voluntary repatriation is a step in the process to a durable and sustainable solution. It is only when all those other factors that you've mentioned, relating to housing, land and property, relating to access to employment, access to healthcare, when those are in place, we actually have a solution. Voluntary repatriation is a step on that route, and freedom of movement is part of that as well. But I agree with you. I suppose we should very quickly, because we've only got 8 minutes left, move on to looking at other possibilities. And I suppose one of the things that cropped up in the panel from Caldo on climate displacement was planned relocation. Ordinarily, when we're talking about UNHCR's role, we're talking about people who've been forced to flee, and it's almost as though that was the last alternative for them, to actually leave their home and go. When we look at climate displacement, please note I'm not using the term climate refugee. That is a deliberate action. There is no such thing. Okay. When we're talking about climate displacement, we have an opportunity to plan relocation in most cases, so that communities who know that they're going to have to leave can make that decision in consultation with their own government if they're just being relocated within their own state, or with other governments. And we see this in the Pacific, where islands that are low-lying may well disappear beneath the Pacific, and those populations need to be relocated. We know in the past that's happened, and people have been relocated to Fiji, for instance, or to the Solomon Islands. Planned relocation like that must respect rights, must respect access to education, access to housing, access to work. And that aspect is something that also then feeds into another idea that we see in the Global Compact on Refugees, this planned concept that we saw discussed in relation to environmental displacement, complementary pathways for displaced persons.
So Jeff, yeah, there were some really interesting conversations related to both resettlement and complementary pathways that took place across the conference. Probably not surprisingly, the most significant conversations on that were in the North America panel, in the Europe conversation, and then it was briefly talked on in the Middle East panel as well. One of the things that is tremendously clear and has been very clear around the process of coming to the Global Compact on Refugees was the need to expand third country solutions. And that is now guided by a multi-year strategy. It's officially the 3-year strategy, but it has some goals that go on to 2030. And it's the 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways. This is a key vehicle for that whole of society approach we were talking about before, to move together in some common goals related to increasing the number of resettlement places, to expanding the number of resettlement countries to some new countries that haven't welcomed that mechanism previously, and also related to that very important concept of burden and responsibility sharing in the Global Compact, to increase the predictability of how many spaces will be available be it through straight resettlement or through complementary pathways. There's been a lot of energy actually around the Global Refugee Forum from the practitioner community on this area. So there are several new initiatives to highlight. So please bear with me on these. So first of all, in January of 2020, with the support of the government of Portugal, the United States, UNHCR, and IOM together, launched the Sustainable Resettlement and Complementary Pathways Initiative. That is even more of a mouthful than GAIN. So it also goes by an acronym. It is known as CRISP. And CRISP is a crucial tool for the implementation of that 3-year strategy we were just talking about. And it particularly aims to provide a tangible way for states to support the expansion of third country solutions and to help realize the contributions of whole of society stakeholders and in the GCR, and most especially pledges made at the Global Refugee Forum. Now, CRISP looks at a few, it doesn't just look at straight resettlement, it also looks at a few key, what we call complementary pathways. So the opportunity to move from a first country of asylum to another country, a third country, on the basis of employment or on education, in addition to resettlement, standard resettlement. There is a mapping happening on that right now, which will be out, is supposed to be out early in the second quarter of this year. That's being done by the Migration Policy Institute, as well as University of Ottawa's Refugee Hub. And we heard a bit from the Refugee Hub in the North America panel earlier in the conference. There is also, on the education pathway specifically, a global task force that's just begun work on third country education pathways. Jeff, you mentioned WUSC earlier. WUSC, along with the Open Society University Networks, are together the inaugural co-chairs of this task force. And those who are interested in participating in that, those who have, for example, scholarship opportunities that it might be good to list, connections they want to make between their university and this task force, are most welcome to reach out to the contacts that were just listed there in the chat. And related to this effort, there's also been the opportunity to list education opportunities, so scholarship opportunities, most especially those that offer that complementary pathway, so the ability to stay in the country longer term. And I believe the site where those can be listed and then they'll be checked and evaluated and posted is also available in the chat right now. As it relates to resettlement and complementary pathways, there are a few very specific calls for research that are needed. Actually, they want it so much, it's listed in the strategy document itself. So first and foremost, the community that came together to form the strategy calls for strategic, actionable, and relevant research on resettlement, because we need to understand better what's working and what isn't working in that. They also very specifically have spelled out the importance of studying refugee participation in resettlement and complementary pathways, and go so far as to say that refugees should be included as research assistants on such projects. And then a final area where more work and support is needed from academia is on the evaluation of inclusive innovation that's being looked at around these complementary pathways, as well as capacity building efforts for governments. Help us understand at a global level in this 3-year period and beyond what's working and isn't. Jeff, I think that's it for that summary. So are there any final points we should address as we come to the top of the hour here?
I can see, I've not had a question highlighted to me as being one that we need to reply to. I suppose the one thing that I would add as we come to the end of this conference is that this is a start. Okay. GAIN was effectively launched at the Global Refugee Forum in December 2019. There were great plans and ideas for it in those few short months between December 2019 and late February 2020 when the world shut down. This conference, this series of webinars, is one consequence of that shutdown. It's a really successful sort of example in terms of the greater inclusion. The idea had been for a conference in Geneva that might have attracted 100 to 150 people in total. We've had this series of conferences across the world, drawing in people from every single time zone. This, though, is just a leaping off point. And the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network has to be something that facilitates research, teaching, and scholarships, okay, for refugees, and for refugee scholars, protection for them. And that is what we need to take forward so that this breadth of research we've been hearing about since the 18th of this month can go further forward so that we can continue it. I'm privileged to work with a bunch of computer scientists at the University of Essex who work on refugee protection matters. But we need to include lawyers, we need to include economists, we need to include social anthropologists, as well as the computer scientists. And GAIN can make that possible. And that's what we need to be taking forward as we move towards the high-level officials meeting in December of this year, where we'll be making a report and talking about what we hope we can do to ensure that, as you have just said, refugees and other persons for concern to UNHCR are part of research that is being undertaken, and that they're not simply part of a case study. They're actually actors in the research that will facilitate solutions and better protection during protracted displacement. So many thanks to UNHCR for making all this possible, particularly Rachel, who has moved mountains behind the scenes to ensure that we've been able to do everything we've done since the 18th. I would also like to thank the Essex team who've made these sessions possible, particularly Claire Simmons, who is the research officer for the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, and also give a shout to Anna Carolina Pintadas. I was close. I apologize, Carol, who has done so much, okay, to facilitate everything we have managed. And it's been an amazing team effort. So thank you, everybody. I hope you found it useful.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.